The Spin-Off Podcast Network. Skinny are helping you show how smart you are with the 1Q quiz, an all-new, super challenging and super quick daily quiz built by the Spin-Off. Every Monday, Skinny are giving you the chance to prove you're smart with the Skinny Extra Credit question. Get it right, and you'll get the chance to score yourself some Skinny Extra mobile credit, so you can text, call, or even video call your group chat and gloat about how big your brain is. T's and C's apply.
The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. No mai hoki mai ki a The Fold, e mihi nei, ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guest today is Simon Power, who is the new-ish CEO of TVNZ, and more to the point, the person kind of tasked with piloting it into the unavoidable collision course it has with RNZ that will ultimately birth ANZPM, the working title for the new media entity that has really consumed the government's kind of thinking around broadcasting and media for much of the last 5 years. He's a former national minister, and so he knows the politics of drafting a bill and so on. And so we kind of get into the weeds of that. This might be quite technical for some of our listeners, but I think he makes a convincing case that it's very, very important that the sort of potentially what might be seen as esoteric things around what type of entity ANZPM is are actually really important, or certainly have the potential to be as it sort of exists down the line. So we talk a lot about the merged entity. We talk about TVNZ's own transition to digital, its own ability to reach the kinds of audiences that have been largely missing from TVNZ and RNZ, but large parts of the rest of our media too. And the biggest chunk of what we discuss is what I'm probably most concerned with as someone who is trying to run a media business in this country, which is that when this thing comes in, it's got $100 million a year of new funding. That's tremendously consequential in the scheme of New Zealand's public media or media at all, that when it arrives on the scene and is fully operational, that it not suffocate the existing New Zealand private media, particularly those in the digital space, like ourselves and so many others, which are out here trying to do a broadly similar thing. And there's so many different ways that this thing can be executed, some of which would I think be really, really positive for the balance of the media, and others of which would be profoundly dangerous and potentially existentially so for the rest of us. But and to all this, I mean, Simon Power is one of two people whose job isn't guaranteed in this. Both himself and Paul Thompson, who leads RNZ, their roles are disestablished by this legislation. There's a very good chance that one of them gets the role. There's also a chance that someone else does. So, he is talking about something which he might ultimately have no role in governing, but certainly the level of thought that has gone into his perspective on this is pretty helpful. We talk about that. We talk about TVNZ's newsroom, which obviously has had a torrid time the last 6 months, and about what drew him to media in the first place. Like I say, it's quite a technical conversation potentially, but I think if you're working in the media in New Zealand or interested in it, how the next 6 months goes, how the submissions change the shape of the ANZPM bill, which is currently before Parliament, all that stuff will really decide how successful the entity is, who it serves, and how it impacts the rest of the media. So stuff's quite important too. So this is Simon Power, TVNZ CEO, on The Fold. Tēnā koe, Simon, and welcome to the fold.
Kia ora, good to be here. Very much looking forward to it.
Yeah, no, I'm excited about it too. There's so much to get across. But I wanted to start by asking, what on earth do you think you're doing? Because you've gone from banking, which is an industry which the main attribute of it in New Zealand is it seems completely unable to stop making money, to media, which no one seems to think can be profitable when you head out a few years. So what are you doing?
What am I doing? There's four parts to the equation which really drew me to the role and the opportunity. Firstly, the NZ Inc. nature of TVNZ, which, various times in my career, that New Zealand lens has been really important to me. And so the opportunity to contribute in that sphere was really, really too good an opportunity to turn down. So that was the first thing. The second thing, which you allude to, is the nature of the industry itself. I mean, it's commercial. TVNZ's a commercial operation, but it's profitability, if you like, is something that has to be closely watched. The model's very different to banking, so I'm really enjoying the changed nature of the commercial model from banking to media. The third thing was I'm a bit of a news and current affairs nut, and so the opportunity to work in that environment was, a big attraction. If you can't find me on the floor at TVNZ, chances are I'm in the newsroom finding out, how things are tracking. I really enjoy that side of it. And then the last thing, which was really important for me, is this potential merger with Radio New Zealand. And, at my core, I'm a bit of a public policy geek. And so the opportunity to work on such an important piece of public policy and legislation was the clincher, really. And so those four things together made the opportunity really, really attractive. And I tell you, it has been, the first 6 months has fulfilled all of that hope, all of that potential, if you like, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it.
It's interesting you say that about the newsroom. As some people I've spoken to at TVNZ have said that your predecessor Kevin Kenrick wasn't as close with the newsroom, but that you are, watching the shows being made and correspondence with the with key talent. Why is it, beyond the sort of being a geek, why is it you've taken such an interest, in the operations of that aspect of the business?
Well, I've been, on the receiving end of it when I did 12 years in politics, and so understanding the construction of stories has been really interesting for me, rather than just being on the other end of the microphone at the interview stage. And watching, going from, I went out to Auckland International Airport at the time that there weren't a lot of flights going on with one of our journalists, carried the sticks for him as he interviewed people around the airport terminal, watched the content being downloaded, then went back and watched it being edited, and then watched the 12 o'clock news run go through. I found the process fascinating. And actually, the truth and the way it's represented and the quality of that information is really, really important to the discussion, not just the public policy discussion, but the public getting the right insights into issues of the day. I find that really interesting. And so I've got to keep my hands off, which I'm very diligent about, but I do find it extremely interesting.
How's the newsroom survived? Because they've been through a bit of a trauma, it's fair to say, in the past few months with the Santa Maria situation and then Jurasic's subsequent resignation. That event where it feels like you really saw the independence and the sort of just the fundamental, I guess, posture of the newsroom came through in that. What was that like to oversee, and how would you characterise the current state of the TVNZ newsroom?
So, look, I was extremely proud, actually, of the way that the newsroom went about, reporting on a situation which was, challenging. I've got nothing but the greatest respect for the notion of editorial independence, and I think that the professionalism that was shown by the newsroom during those days was first class. I think that the newsroom is in really good shape. They are on task and doing what they love. I'm very proud to be part of that team, and in some cases, leading that team. It's a group of people whose desire to tell the stories of New Zealanders I greatly admire. and the opportunity to sit down with some of those journalists who have been there for some of the most important things that have occurred in New Zealand's history in the last period is something that I really enjoy and value. So, I think they're in good shape.
One thing which is interesting to me is, the 6pm news, and particularly TVNZ 6pm news, remains the biggest single audience block for any New Zealand media product. And it has historically been, entirely understandably, the dead centre of what that newsroom kind of is working towards. Yet, over time, I mean, that audience is ageing, and we'll talk about that. But certainly, if you're going to kind of reach the aspirational audiences, which on some level the merger is entirely about, it has to kind of, if not, it never forgets about 6pm, but certainly it's going to get more broad than that. Is that a project that's underway, and how is that going to be sort of handled for the newsroom, basically being stretched to reach a lot of different audience in different places?
Yeah, it's quite early to say, but 6 News remains an absolute critical core part of what TVNZ produces every day. And then making sure that we're using that platform to reach some audiences who might prefer a digital platform with the same or similar content is all part of making sure that we are reaching the audiences that you describe. The opportunity that the merger with Radio New Zealand presents is to enhance and grow that capability, and then to try and reach audiences that are even further, even harder to reach presently for all media, actually. And so that's actually one of the really optimistic and exciting parts about this potential merger, which I've said publicly TVNZ are very, very supportive of.
We'll talk about the merger a bit later on, because I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to get into there. I just want to get into the annual results a little bit. There are only some very sort of top-line figures in it, but I want to talk about linear and then digital separately, because I think you're starting to see some quite interesting and potentially some quite challenging stuff around linear audiences. Like I get sent the Nielsen ratings, or all those that are publicly released, which is very limited, but there's a very steady and quite well-established decline in linear audiences now, and I understand that they don't capture the whole spread of where people can encounter shows now, but fundamentally that sense of linear being the big kind of centre of New Zealand's attention is really being challenged, and I think particularly about 25 to 54, where it's common to see only 4 shows with more than 100,000 viewers, or over a 1 in 20 audience share, which is quite unimaginable compared to what TV was even 10 or 15 years ago, and that's with Nielsen acknowledging that it's on some level slightly overstated some of those numbers lately. What would you characterise as the state of linear, particularly for that sort of under 50 kind of audience? Yeah,
I mean, you're right. I wouldn't describe it quite as dramatically. So I think that our task, if you like, is to make sure that where we're seeing decline in linear audiences, that we are providing other platforms for our audiences to be entertained, educated, informed on the way through. So it's balancing off the kind of steady numbers decreasing with an increase using other platforms. I would say, though, that it still remains that at various times, and you're right about the overall landscape, but at various times and various shows, particularly with TV1, that those numbers are still very significant, and we can't lose sight of that. It is still a critical part of our audience to make sure that we're reaching them on a platform that they respect, trust, and have had a long relationship with. So there is a bit of a trade-off. But I always think about it the way I'd describe it is, rather than jumping off the wharf into the cold water, it's kind of wading into the water. And you have to be careful that it's a steady but well signposted transition.
The thing that's and I think that TVNZ has managed that very well with TVNZ on demand, now TVNZ Plus. It's persistently tried to kind of have a foot in an experimental era, even if you think about I think things like which is still around, and there are opportunities there to go and reach audience. The thing that is less clear is whether whether TVNZ can hold the same audience scale and mind share that it once commanded on TV in a digital space. And that's on some level seems impossible. But the thing which is striking to me is, you rightly are very sure, I'm sure you're very proud of the 32% increase in total streams year on year, up to over 350 million. And the thing that's it's very hard trying to compare digital and linear numbers, but that amounts to a little more than a stream a week per person, when you extrapolate it that way, versus it used to be TVNZ could probably command a couple of hours of people's attention every day. So the transition is just the numbers are orders of magnitude different in scale. And I guess, do you think that it's ever realistic to imagine, even in some kind of 10, 15 years into the future, that TVNZ Plus can capture that kind of audience scale and reach all those communities where you feel like we're missing?
Yes, I do. And I think that the potential merger with RNZ helps enable different platforms based presumably off a digital backbone, which TVNZ Plus forms such an important part of, and it's easy to talk about the scale of magnitude of difference, which I understand why you'd make that point, which is why you've got to keep investing in it. So at no point can you say job done with these transitions. There's always going to be new trends emerging that we have to be close to, and in many cases ahead of. I mean, is a classic example. It's easy to sort of talk about it as a small contributor to reaching these audiences that otherwise wouldn't be reached. Actually, in July, 3 million video views, 711,000 TikTok views, and 1 million Facebook video views. It is reaching an audience that other mediums aren't reaching. Could we do more? Of course. Could we invest more? Well, I think that's part of the reason that we're so focused on our new IP platform investment, and that's one of the reasons why you saw our costs lift slightly this last financial year. The job's not done, but I think that the transition is being laid out structurally in a way that makes sense and gives options. And I think that's the important bit, not locking yourself into an optionless future or a limited number of options. So that's how we're thinking about it.
So when you're taking the example of and those statistics you just cited, which are pretty impressive, especially given the scale of the team relative to the scale of the balance of TVNZ, they're also built on, TikTok and Facebook in terms of where those views are happening, which are platforms that are notoriously fickle and notoriously hard to monetize on for creators. But they are also where the action is, especially for those younger audiences. There's a version of the future where I imagine like an ANZPM potentially, having a decent chunk of its staff devoted to TikTok, which would be really confronting, for example, to the New Zealand production sector, which likes to make a wholly different style of production. How do you see that? Is that something that you can see happening? And how do you balance the desire of the infrastructure of New Zealand to make a particular product with the desire of the audience to watch something entirely different?
That's a great question.
Isn't it?
That is a great question. But that's exactly what we are spending, big parts of the week thinking about. One of the things that struck me since I've been in this role actually is, because of its scale and place in the ecosystem, the responsibility that TVNZ has to the production sector. And also to the advertising and media agency industry, who, are relying on us as that medium to reach their customers. And the Communications Council and the like would would use numbers like about 2.4% of GDP is in that cohort of activity which occurs in their sphere of influence, where we assist in reaching those audiences. So TVNZ's role in the middle of that broader system, which I think you're describing, is something that I must admit it struck me the responsibility that sits with TVNZ and by definition the new public media entity to understand its responsibilities to both sides of the equation. I think that can be done. It's just a matter of thinking about the strategic, as I said before, the strategic necessity to keep your options open and not closing. And this is, unfortunately, I think where you might want to talk about this a bit later, but where the legislation for the public media entity creates a few grey areas, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about that kind of a fair amount shortly, but I do think it's kind of worth drilling into that because there is a sense that, I mean, again, the whole rationale for the merger is the sense that TVNZ and RNZ both serve an older New Zealand audience very well, and there has been an assurance throughout this that nothing will change or that what is non-commercial will not be non-commercial.
Yes.
We might get to some of the complexities of that in a bit, but associated with that is that you've got two organisations which have spent decades learning how to do a particular thing incredibly well and are now going to be tasked with learning something entirely new at the same time, some of which will feel like it's in conflict with the values and the approach. How will, obviously we don't know yet, you're one of the two people whose job insecurity over the next year.
That's right.
But how will...
Next 6 months.
True.
Yeah.
Very relaxing. But how will, how do you sort of encourage an environment that embraces innovation while kind of defending those traditional values? Because that does seem like actually a harder thing than it might otherwise appear.
Well, let me just flip it slightly, if I may, and just say that the way I think about it is for us to operate successfully, we have to operate at scale. And so we have to reach those audiences at scale for the machinery of the operation to correctly compete, but also to deliver. That scale is what affords you the opportunity to work in areas to reach audiences that you wouldn't otherwise reach. It's that kind of opportunity that the scale interaction presents. If you weren't operating at scale, reaching a diverse range of audiences who are smaller in number, that gets a lot more complex for a business model. So the new public media entity affords that opportunity, but it is still fueled by the commercial, or partly fueled by the commercial opportunities that the TVNZ arm will bring to the new media entity. So they're not necessarily in conflict. In fact, you need the scale to achieve the reach into audiences that you otherwise wouldn't be able to reach.
The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to oOh!media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today.
And the other aspect that we haven't kind of touched on before we get into the merger proper, is that sense that the value of a linear viewer in terms of what it delivers commercially versus a TVNZ Plus viewer. That hasn't been made public. I'm not even sure if you can fully disentangle the two, but certainly one feels a lot smaller, both in terms of the amount of content they consume and the lower ad load that we have in a TVNZ Plus. Setting aside the fact that once you get into, like I say, these distributed platforms, you're not going to be deriving any income from them at all, or have a far more limited ability to do so. Is that what the 100 million is for, essentially? Does it acknowledge the fact that when you move into these spaces, TVNZ's commercial arm almost starts to sunset with, or certainly shrinks proportionately, as it moves into digital?
So I guess that's a question for the Minister as he thinks about how that balance might occur. But I think about it slightly differently, which is that the better the commercial arm of the new entity can do, the more that can be reinvested into local content and into technology which allows those audiences to be reached through different platforms, the less the impact is on the taxpayer. So actually, I think a not-for-profit model, which is what seems to be presupposed, doesn't mean there's no operating surplus. It just simply means, presumably, that you don't return a dividend to the shareholder. So there is an opportunity for that arm of the business to help fuel the opportunities either through platforms, either through more local content, which is the key differentiator between us and the international streamers, to really make the new public media entity fly. And I think, it's nuanced, but if you have the right strategic approach to the setup of the new organisation, that's one of the real upsides. Look, in any merger, you want it to be value accretive, not value destructive. And so this is an opportunity to really grow this set of audience reach. And if the organisation is audience centric and is responding to what it is that audiences want to see, want to hear, but also on the platforms they want to see and hear it, there's no good reason why it can't coexist.
Yeah, I think that note, which I gather was part of your submission on the ANZPM bill, that audience centricity be a kind of a bedrock of it is an important one. And I don't think, obviously everyone's always about their audience, but there's a difference between about the audience you have versus the audience you're sort of required to get or you're missing. And I think that's the thing that maybe, honestly, none of the New Zealand media has really done a perfect job of, and that's the opportunity.
Well, here's the opportunity. That's right. I mean, the key to that is, it has to be done in a way that reflects back what audiences will tune in for, both, audio, visual, digital, etc. The word that's used in the bill, enlighten, is not a word I like. It's got a tone of, gosh, aren't you lucky we're here, as opposed to, I like educate better because it says, here are the facts, let's have a debate, you make your own mind up. And I like that as a way of thinking about the opportunity.
It's quite interesting, right, because historically, if you look at the very sort of origins of public media, they did have quite a paternalistic quality to them. It was like the great unwashed and uneducated, here is how you should think about your nation kind of thing. And often that, that was not uncomplicated, but it was made to be probably oversimplified by those broadcasters. And I think, here, particularly with all the different communities that we're serving, to start to presuppose what it is they'll be interested in or what they should be interested in, that there's a very high chance of some expensive failures, I suppose. One thing before we get into the merger proper is, both our organisations have participated in the Public Interest Journalism Fund, and I think it's been underappreciated the extent to which that, setting aside the work that has been created, but certainly the idea of it has been weaponised and has become subject to something which is perceived as a government influence over our editorial content. What impact has that had on the newsroom and on public confidence or the public's relationship with TVNZ's, particularly its news products? Pretty
minimal, from our point of view. There's, our our engagement with the fund has been, relatively limited. That's not to say that, we're not working with New Zealand On Air and the fund and, for one or two projects, but it hasn't probably been as embedded as in some other news organisations. But you make a really, really strong point, which is that, and it comes back to the new public media entity, is that there is an issue of substance around the editorial independence and the ability to get those trust quotients to the point where misinformation and disinformation is put aside by our listeners or our viewers. There's also a perception issue, and it's really important that sufficient distance sits between those organisations or ministries that fund the new entity and the way the new entity operates in of itself. That perception has the potential to impact on that trust factor, and I think that should be a really important part of the Select Committee process, is making sure that the structure of the new entity gives it its best chance when it comes to enshrining that editorial independence and giving sufficient distance. That's not to say that, I think you used the phrase weaponised, that's not to say that there aren't always issues in that sphere, but the perception part is just such an important factor here.
I mean, and that's probably a good way to come into starting to talk about the merger itself, because there is a bit of a perception out there. I don't think it's anywhere near a majority of our population, but certainly that the relationship between media and government is too cosy, and that suddenly having a new entity which has more direct funding than any entity has ever had in our history, there's a high chance that those people who are already of a mind to kind of be suspicious of the motives and outputs of the media more broadly will seize upon this as something other than what it intends to be. How do you think that they could change that? Because I know that you're critical of the idea of an autonomous Crown entity as the appropriate vehicle for this. I also think, while right now we have a relatively benign political environment in terms of relationships to the media, almost no other similar country has one right now. You look at the way the BBC has become so politicised in the UK, at least the Conservative Party's attacks on it have been. Trump's attacks on the quote-unquote liberal media in the US. It's almost weird that we don't have that here in some respects. Long may it continue. But how can the creation of this avoid almost designing its failure, or at least a really difficult birth to it into the legislation which creates it?
Yeah, so we've made our submission. We've put our submission into the Select Committee, and we tackle kind of this issue of the structure of the new organisation head on in that submission. Look, I have said TVNZ is supportive of this idea. I'm supportive of this idea. I knew when I came into the role that this was the looming piece of work sitting there, and I came in thinking I hopefully can make a contribution to making sure that it kicks off in a successful way. I have also said, though, that the legislation which enacts the arrival of this new entity is poorly drafted, and it is. And the thing that if you think about entities in a series of concentric circles moving out from the core of the government public sector, right on the margins of those is the Crown entity company, which effectively allows complete independence from ministerial intervention. Radio New Zealand and Television New Zealand at present are both that model. This would pull that entity in one set of circles closer to the centre, and I think that our submission will be that is the wrong approach.
So how would that, in terms of the ability of a minister or the ability of a minister to be perceived to impact a more operational aspect of the entity, what is the difference between those two concentric rings, if you will.
Well, one allows for ministerial direction and one doesn't.
So what kind of ministerial direction is plausible under the current approach?
Under the Crown Entity Company?
Yes.
No,
No, under the Autonomous Crown Entity.
Yeah. So it's a limited general power. So what the bill does is it sets out what a minister's powers are and then makes clear where they can't be exercised. So says what it can do, then says what it can't do. And then in 2 or 3 parts in the bill, but certainly under the ministerial powers section, then describes why editorial independence is so important as a kind of drop down, if you like. So the way I would think about this is twofold. It still leaves a residual power in the legislation for a minister to give direction. My question is why? Why would you have that residual power in there if trust and an alternate to misinformation and disinformation is so central to the core of the bill? And why don't you bring in a new clause 6, for example, straight after the treaty clause, which enshrines on its own pillars editorial independence right at the front of the bill and makes it crystal clear that the principled part of the legislation enshrines that rather than appearing in 2 or 3 places in the bill as kind of a bit of an afterthought. I think that's really important. And I think that the very nature of an autonomous Crown entity, even if in substance this existing government and the next government didn't use those powers at all, the fact that they're residually sitting there presents an opportunity. And as I said, publicly a week or so ago, I'm not worried about this government. I'm not worried about the next government, actually. But if in 15 years' time a more, activist minister or government decided that they wanted to, influence the outcome, that power's sitting there. And the question you've got to ask yourself is if public media independence is the core of the idea, the kernel of the idea, why would you blur that perception by allowing that power to exist under the autonomous Crown entity model? So I think that's how I think about it. Here's a chance I come back to this point, here's a chance to aggregate the value and the opportunity of the entity rather than to kick it off with a slight question mark over that ministerial opportunity.
I mean, one of the things that is on some level plausible is that the minister might say, drama is incredibly important to New Zealand, or that a particular type of programming. I mean, the previous charter kind of and the Broadcasting Act itself make explicit reference to these kind of protected genres, which, while desirable, also feel increasingly kind of detached from the very blurry and fragmented world that we're in now. Do you, what do you think of the Broadcasting Act and of how this entity should relate to things like that and New Zealand On Air, like the general kind of existing infrastructure of New Zealand's public media, I suppose?
Do we really want a minister of the Crown telling us whether or not we've got enough drama on TV? Like, honestly, I mean, the example that this is the thing I'm worried about, actually, is it's less about.
I don't think it's about the news. I just think it's about the things that you make, in a lot of ways.
I just think you get on and leave it to the experts that are running, running the organisation. As far as the infrastructure is concerned, I would step back and say, look, there are some areas where the bill is very unclear. The role of the commercial opportunity in the bill barely gets a mention, and it certainly doesn't feature strongly in any operative clauses. The role of New Zealand On Air is not as clear as it could be for that part of the infrastructure of the ecosystem, if you like, to use the parlance. And so to that end, there is still a requirement, and I'm sure the Select Committee will think about this deeply, will this bill make a statement about what the sector needs to look like alongside this new media entity? I think that's going to be quite an important consideration for the Select Committee.
What do you think about the relationship between New Zealand On Air? Because that effectively just goes away. You are now direct commissioning for the first time, and not for the first time, because obviously you're currently direct commissioning some shows, but that you become the commissioner in charge of everything, do you have a view about the impact of this on New Zealand On Air? And there's some kind of vague idea that seems to be floating around that New Zealand On Air and ANZPM will discuss have some kind of open line about what sort of things they commission, which also doesn't seem to be compatible with the kind of natural and mostly healthy competition that will exist between the things or the entities that New Zealand On Air continue to interact with and ANZPM itself.
Look, I think, if I was New Zealand On Air, I would be turning up wanting clarity through the select committee process, and once the bill comes out of select committee, I think in late January. So I think that's kind of to one side. I think the bill requires the new entity to collaborate with other parts of the sector. And it makes sense when there's a whole lot of intellectual property and experience sitting in New Zealand On Air that, those sorts of discussions could occur. But there will certainly be, in some cases, a step in the commissioning process which will be, lifted out according to from what we've seen from the bill. I still think, though, that how that's actually going to occur requires some consideration from the Select Committee before the bill goes back to Parliament. It's quite short on some of the operational detail. That's fine if the operational detail is being considered alongside the legislation. And so going back to first principles, you say, well, is the legislation a principles-based piece of legislation, or is it going to be highly prescriptive? And it's a bit confused. The legislation's a bit confused. So in some areas it's principled. The Charter is quite specific and quite prescriptive compared to some of the other charters that we've looked at, around the world. So there's a bit of, rebalancing to do, is the way that I'd describe it during that select committee process.
Another aspect that is unclear, I think it talks about, again, I'm paraphrasing, but that which is currently non-commercial shall remain non-commercial. And it's very easy to understand how that works in the case of something like RNZ National or Concert. But where it's, right now, TVNZ makes barely any podcasts, RNZ makes a bunch of them. Does that mean that podcasting will be a non-commercial area, or does it mean that currently commissioned RNZ podcasts will stay non-commercial, or like it, and that is material for the sector. We're currently recording a podcast which should be commercialised in an ideal world, and a lot of the digital media industry in the private sector in New Zealand is on some level quite nascent. And if this new entity comes in with a heavy amount of subsidy and is even if it's just sort of taking a sort of a nominal commercial fee, it has the potential to kind of collapse these commercially funded operations like ours, for example. I am talking out of self-interest here, but I'm very curious about how the new entity will interact with the private sector media, because there is a world in which it actually suffocates it, particularly in digital environments, which, as we know, the commercial foundations are just far different to the sort of linear and analogue ones that they replace.
Yeah, I think, as I said before, the bill at this stage, speaks heavily to collaboration with the rest of the sector. As far as the commercialisation of different products goes, actually, it's just not clear. And so I think that the Select Committee, again, has got a bit of it is clear in respect of the area that you describe as ring-fenced, but more broadly, it'll be interesting to draw out from the Select Committee and their report back to the House how they're thinking about that, because that will help inform, the new board and the new management's view of how the public media entity will be strategically constructed, as well as what its strategic plan might look like. So I think there are some key questions that are unanswered by the legislation, and that's certainly one of the ones I'd put in that pile.
In terms of your perspective, and again, we don't know who's going to be running the thing. It might be you, might be Paul, might be neither of you. But the relationship with those who are already either meeting that audience or at least aspiring to meet the sort of more diverse missing audience, as you might say. There has been fear, and I've spoken to a number of people who are operators or producers on this podcast over the past year or so, that this new entity comes in and basically just either squeezes them, takes talent, takes market share, like that it has that it, without even necessarily meaning to, that it sort of takes the breath out of the lungs of the currently existing operators, whether that's Pacific Media or iwi Radio, all the people who are out there trying to meet the sort of missing audiences. What's your, is that inevitable, or how do you avoid that, or is there a more collaborative vision that you might have for how this money might be spent?
Yeah, I've heard a bit of that in market as well. I'm just not sure that that'll be the case. That a new entity, as I say, required under the legislation to collaborate. The more views there are out there, the better.
But there's collaboration, and then like you can do lip service collaboration, or you can do it's another area where there is a huge amount of imprecision in the language.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I accept that. But I also think there's an opportunity during the select committee to really nugget out what that word and that phrase means operationally. And it might be that the select committee says, actually, we're going to retain it in a legislative sense. You have to work it out when you get there, or whoever gets there. But I also think this new entity will operate in two kind of markets: the domestic market, and then what are we seeing from international, streamers? Which part of that market are we operating in as well? And I think the opportunity to, potentially, and again, this is, I'm getting way ahead of myself here, but potentially the opportunity to collaborate can be across a range of opportunities. And I wouldn't come into it with the mindset that this is, how did you describe it? A big gravitational pull, rather than it's an opportunity to really add value to the whole sector. And I know I've said it a couple of times, but it has to be value accretive, this proposal. As soon as it starts undermining either existing opportunity within the two organisations or has anything but a positive effect on the broader media ecosystem, then you've got to stop and ask yourself some questions.
Right, because it's interesting, because historically TVNZ has not always behaved that way, and that's entirely understandable. It's currently a wholly commercial organisation, essentially. But, so for example, its relationship with Freeview has been fraught at various times, and there is a sort of a known whole, or there's certainly been conjecture. We published some about what an all of New Zealand streaming platform might look like, whereby there might be your TVNZ originals, but potentially you would have other channels within it that could be hosted by other sort of creators, and I think that it's that sort of area which is, again, unimagined in the legislation, but it's absolutely crucial in terms of whether it is value accretive to the sector, and there are homes for a lot of different kinds of content that can be surfaced to different audiences in different ways, versus the idea of because there's no way around it. $100 million a year in a sector of our scale is a phenomenal sum of money, especially if you look at it solely on the content creation side.
Yeah, but let's come back to that's TVNZ. We are a commercial organisation and we compete. As part of a new public media entity with a shared shareholder with Radio New Zealand, that mandate for the new organisation is
It's different, but
it is different.
But TVNZ is going to be a much larger share of the headcount going into this thing, and commercial is the fundamental DNA of TVNZ. And I think that's the thing which, that will be quite difficult to potentially train out unless there is more explicit direction around.
Well, the other thing is, that's a cultural question, right?
It is a cultural question.
It's a cultural question. So whoever leads the new organisation, merging two entities together at a structural level is one thing. Getting the right formula from the legislation to operationalise, to run the machinery so that it understands its role in the sector is a second question. And then the third question is what cultural emissions does this organisation wish to place into market, internally? What sort of talent do you need? All of those sort of things. So I kind of think of those three pillars as being kind of intertwined, but also they're deliberate in their own right.
So do you have a sense that were you to be the sort of, have you gone for the job? Like, I don't even know what stage that aspect of it's at. Is it an inevitability that you will, do you think, or close to?
An inevitability that
you will go for the job?
No, look, I'm holding my cards pretty close to my chest. I haven't made a decision yet. I knew what I was coming in to do in this role. I'm very happy to do it. But I've got a job to do, and my job is to make sure that Television New Zealand arrives on the 1st of March with its engines running, operating at the fullest capacity, doing the best it can for its own staff and its audiences and its shareholder on the 1st of March. We certainly don't want to be, as I've described it to my team, limping to the start line. I'm much more interested in arriving in a way that says we're ready to help. And so that's first and foremost in the front of my mind at the moment.
Yeah, based on your experience of the last 6 months,
when you say it like that, it's
it's true. It's true.
Yeah.
Do you feel like the organisation has it in itself to move from basically a purely competitive mindset to that more collaborative one, that it can be a sort of in concert with RNZ, be a force that kind of wraps the balance of New Zealand's media, among its operations and helps uplift it, as opposed to kind of just gradually suffocating it with the advantages of scale and subsidy?
Yeah, all I can tell you is how TVNZers are feeling at the moment, which is excited about the opportunity. I'm not running the public media entity. The legislation hasn't passed yet, so we might be getting a bit ahead of ourselves as to what it might do and what it might look like.
Down the pipe real quick.
I'll certainly grant you that. And it's I'm reminded of an episode of Yes Minister when I look at this legislative time frame, I would say it's very courageous. But getting past that, TVNZ is coming at this as enthusiastically as possible, and we understand that our contribution is to be the commercial engine of the new entity, but also that our mandate, once these two entities are merged, would become different, and so that's exciting.
Hey, thank you so much for coming up here and being willing to have such a knotty conversation about things which are fundamentally undecided yet for so much of it. But it's been great to meet you and have you up here on The Fold.
It's been great to be here, and thanks very much for having us in.
The Fold was brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network. It was hosted by Duncan Greive, produced by T.I. Butler, with production management by Rachel LaRue and series production by Jane Yee.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
K-pop to me means more than just listening to music. It's learning to be myself.
The Spin-Off's new documentary, K-Pollies, follows 3 Pacific youth obsessed with K-pop. In a one-off documentary, see what they've found in Korean pop culture and how they bridge it with their own.
When you start dressing, looking different, everyone side-eyes you. But in K-pop, they're just like, no, celebrate yourself.
Watch K-Pollies today at thespinoff.co.nz/videos. Made with the support of New Zealand On Air. The Spin-Off Podcast Network.